Early 1943. A Japanese garrison on the island of New Georgia in the Solomon Islands chain. Imperial Japanese Navy pilots stationed at Munda Airfield had spent months building a reputation that preceded them across the Pacific. Their Mitsubishi A6M Zeros had humiliated every Allied fighter sent against them. The Americans had thrown Wildcats, Airacobras, and Warhawks into the skies over the Solomons, and the Zero had chewed through them all. So when reports arrived that the Americans were fielding a new fighter, a big, bent-winged machine that looked more like a broken gull than a combat aircraft, the reaction among Japanese aviators was dismissive. It was too large, too heavy. The bent wings were an engineering oddity, not a tactical advantage. One more American attempt to match what could not be matched. What Japanese pilots stationed across the Solomons did not know was that the strange whistling sound they would soon hear, cutting through the Pacific air, would become the last thing many of them ever heard. The aircraft making that sound, the Vought F4U Corsair, would kill more Japanese planes than any other Allied fighter. It would drive the Imperial Japanese Navy and Air Force to abandon air-to-air combat entirely. And the haunting whistle that announced its arrival would earn it a name from the Japanese themselves, one spoken not with mockery but with dread. They called it Shi no Kuchibue, whistling death. To understand how one aircraft could transform an entire theatre of war, you have to understand how completely Japan owned the skies when the war began. On December 7th, 1941, when Japanese Zeros screamed over Pearl Harbor, America got its first devastating lesson in what it was up against. The Zero was a masterpiece of aggressive engineering. Mitsubishi's designers, led by Jiro Horikoshi, had sacrificed everything: armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, structural reinforcement, to achieve a single objective: speed and agility at any cost. The result was an aircraft that could outclimb, outturn, and outrun virtually everything the Allies put in the sky against it. In the early months of the Pacific War, the Zero achieved a staggering 12-to-1 kill ratio against Allied aircraft. It was not just winning engagements, it was annihilating the opposition. American pilots who survived encounters with the Zero came back with the same stunned report: nothing they did worked. The Zero was faster on the climb, tighter on the turn, and flown by pilots who had been honing their skills in combat over China for years before Pearl Harbor ever happened. The United States War Department understood that winning the Pacific meant solving the Zero problem. And in 1938, years before Pearl Harbor, the Navy had already sent out a call for a new fighter that could outperform anything in the sky. The specification demanded a minimum speed of 350 miles per hour, a stall speed under 70 miles per hour, and the ability to operate from aircraft carriers. The contract went to Chance Vought, and the design team was led by Rex Beisel, an engineer who understood that the answer to every problem in aerial combat started with the engine. Beisel selected the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a radial engine that produced over 2,000 horsepower. It was the most powerful engine available for a single-seat fighter, and it created an immediate design challenge. An engine that powerful demanded a massive propeller to convert that horsepower into thrust. The solution was a 13-foot, 3-blade Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller, the largest ever fitted to a fighter aircraft. But a 13-foot propeller on a conventional airframe would require absurdly long landing gear to achieve ground clearance, gear that would be too heavy and too fragile for carrier landings. Beisel's team solved the problem with what became the Corsair's most recognizable feature, the inverted gull wing. By bending the wings downward at the root and then back upward, they lowered the fuselage closer to the ground, while still giving the enormous propeller the clearance it needed. It was an elegant solution to an impossible engineering constraint, and it created something else entirely by accident. The junction where those bent wings met the fuselage housed oil cooler intakes. When the Corsair flew at speed, air forced through those intakes produced a distinctive, high-pitched whistle. At altitude, it was merely unusual. In a dive, it became unearthly. In May of 1940, the prototype took its maiden flight and broke the speed record for a single-engine fighter, exceeding 400 miles per hour in level flight. No Allied or Axis fighter could match it. The Corsair was, on paper, exactly the weapon America needed. But paper and combat are different things. The same design features that made the Corsair fast made it dangerous to its own pilots. The massive engine created a long nose that severely restricted forward visibility during carrier approaches. The torque from that enormous propeller generated asymmetric airflow over the wings, which meant that during slow-speed approaches, one wing could stall before the other, sending the aircraft into an unexpected roll at the worst possible moment. At the Marine Corps Air Station at Mojave, training accidents piled up at an alarming rate. At least 144 Corsair training accidents were recorded at that single facility. Pilots started calling the aircraft the Ensign Eliminator. The Navy, unwilling to risk its carrier decks with an aircraft that killed its own trainees, made a decision that would inadvertently reshape the Pacific Air War. They pulled the Corsair from carrier duty and reassigned it to land-based Marine Corps squadrons. It was meant as a demotion. It became a liberation. Freed from the constraints of carrier operations, Marine pilots could focus on what the Corsair did better than anything else in the sky. Fight. Japanese intelligence noted the arrival of the new American fighter type in the Solomons in early 1943 with professional interest but no alarm. Their assessments catalogued its specifications alongside other Allied types and concluded that the Zero's superior maneuverability would continue to dominate. After all, every new American fighter had been measured against the Zero and found wanting. There was no reason to believe this one would be different. The Corsair's first combat test came on February 14, 1943, in an engagement that would later be called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Marine Fighting Squadron 124, VMF 124, escorted Army bombers on a strike against Japanese shipping and positions near Bougainville. The mission called for the Corsairs to provide high cover, while P-40 Warhawks and P-38 Lightnings handled the medium and low altitudes. It was a straightforward escort mission, the kind that should have showcased the Corsair's strengths. Instead, it exposed the gap between an aircraft's potential and its pilot's readiness. Japanese Zeros from the 11th Air Fleet intercepted in force. Approximately 50 Japanese fighters dove into the American formation, and what followed was a brutal education. Corsair pilots, still learning the temperamental habits of their new aircraft, made the fatal mistake of trying to dogfight with the Zeros, turning and chasing in exactly the kind of low-speed maneuvering contest that played to the Zero's greatest strength. The results were predictable and painful. The Americans suffered losses across multiple aircraft types, including Corsairs, Warhawks, Lightnings, and the bombers they were supposed to protect. Japanese pilots who participated returned to their fields at Kahili and Balale with confirmation of what they already believed. The new American plane was big, fast in a straight line, but unable to match the Zero when the fighting got close and turned into the swirling knife fight that decided engagements in the Pacific. Reports filed through Japanese channels described the bent-winged fighter as just another victim for experienced Zero pilots, nothing to concern themselves with. But within that bloody debut lay the seeds of a transformation that Japanese intelligence entirely missed. American pilots who survived the Valentine's Day action came back with something more valuable than a victory. They came back with knowledge. They had seen, firsthand, what happened when you tried to fight the Zero on its own terms. And they had discovered something else, something the Japanese reports failed to mention. The Corsair could take a beating that would have torn a Wildcat or a Zero apart. Pilots who absorbed hits that should have been fatal discovered their aircraft still flying, still responding to the controls, still capable of carrying them home across miles of open ocean. Machine gun rounds that would have ignited a Zero's unprotected fuel tanks were absorbed by the Corsair's self-sealing tanks without catastrophic fire. Cannon strikes that would have shattered a lighter airframe were stopped by the Corsair's robust construction with damage that was serious but survivable. The armor plating behind the pilot's seat, a luxury that Mitsubishi's weight-obsessed designers had considered unthinkable, stopped rounds that would have killed the men flying the aircraft. In the Zero, a mistake in combat was a death sentence. In the Corsair, a mistake was a lesson you lived to apply next time. This understanding was amplified by intelligence that had been quietly reshaping American air combat doctrine since the previous summer. In July of 1942, a Zero, participating in the raid on Dutch Harbour in the Aleutian Islands, had crashed on Akutan Island. The pilot was killed, but the aircraft remained largely intact, the first mostly complete Zero ever captured by the Allies. American engineers and test pilots spent weeks dissecting the Akutan Zero, and what they found changed everything. The Zero's legendary agility came at a devastating cost. It had no armor plating whatsoever. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing, meaning that a single incendiary round could turn the aircraft into a fireball. Its lightweight construction meant that at high speeds, particularly in dives, the control surfaces stiffened to the point of near uselessness, and critically, the Zero rolled sluggishly to the right at speed. The engineers had found the Dragon's weaknesses. The Corsair's designers had already, without knowing it, built the Dragon Slayer. The tactical doctrine that emerged was brutally simple. Never turn with a Zero. Never engage in the low-altitude turning fights that Japanese pilots excelled at. Instead, use the Corsair's superior speed and climb rate to gain altitude, dive on the Zero from above, pour in firepower from the Corsair's 650 caliber Browning machine guns, and if you miss, do not turn to re-engage. Use your speed to climb back to altitude and set up another diving pass. The Corsair's 50 caliber guns could fire approximately 2,400 rounds combined, a volume of fire that the lightly built Zero simply could not survive. Japanese pilots who had spent years perfecting the art of the turning dogfight found themselves facing an enemy who refused to play their game. By the spring and summer of 1943, the results began to shift dramatically. Corsair pilots who had survived those early brutal engagements had internalized the new doctrine, and they were teaching it to every replacement who arrived. The transformation was measurable in kill ratios that climbed week by week. First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh of VMF 124 became the first Corsair ace, shooting down his fifth confirmed kill and then continuing well beyond it. Walsh was the embodiment of the new American approach. He was aggressive but disciplined, willing to push the Corsair to its absolute limits while refusing to be drawn into the turning fights that the Zero still dominated. Walsh's engagements demonstrated the new doctrine in lethal practice. On August 15, 1943, Walsh was escorting bombers on a strike near Vella La Vella when approximately 50 Japanese aircraft attacked the formation. It was the kind of overwhelming numerical superiority that had allowed the Japanese to slaughter American formations earlier in the war. But Walsh and his fellow Corsair pilots did not panic. They did not scatter. They used their altitude advantage to dive into the Japanese formation, make slashing attacks at speeds the Zeros could not match, and then zoom climbed back to altitude to set up the next pass. In the furious engagement that followed, Walsh personally shot down 4 enemy aircraft. His Corsair was hit repeatedly during the fight, the engine trailing smoke, hydraulic fluid leaking, but the rugged airframe absorbed the punishment and kept flying. Walsh nursed his battered fighter back toward friendly territory and crash-landed in the water near Vella La Vella, where he was rescued by a Coast Watchers team. 2 weeks later, on August 30th, Walsh again demonstrated what the Corsair could do in the hands of a pilot who understood its strengths. Engaging another large Japanese formation, he again shot down multiple aircraft, while his own Corsair absorbed damage that would have been immediately fatal to a Zero. For these actions, across both engagements, Walsh received the Medal of Honor. His citation detailed not just his personal courage, but the capability of the aircraft that kept him alive long enough to demonstrate it. Walsh would finish the war with 21 confirmed aerial victories, nearly all of them in the Corsair. Japanese pilots who faced the Corsair in those months reported a growing unease through channels that would later be captured in interrogation records and post-war interviews. The new American fighter was not behaving according to the rules they had mastered. It was too big, too obviously heavy, to be this fast in a climb, and it could absorb punishment that defied every expectation based on their experience. Zero pilots who landed solid, concentrated bursts on the bent-winged fighters watched in frustration as the Americans kept flying, kept fighting, kept climbing away to set up another devastating pass. Worse still, a single burst from the Corsair's 650 caliber guns was enough to turn a zero into a torch. The exchange rate was becoming catastrophically one-sided. A zero pilot needed to land dozens of hits to bring down a Corsair. A Corsair pilot needed only a few seconds of concentrated fire to destroy a zero. The mathematics of attrition, which had once so heavily favored Japan, had reversed. The rules that had governed Pacific air combat since the war began were breaking down, and the Japanese pilots watching their comrades disappear in balls of flame understood it before their commanders did. Then came the Black Sheep. Marine Fighting Squadron 214, VMF 214, arrived in the Solomon Islands in September of 1943, under the command of Major Gregory Boyington, a barrel-chested, hard-drinking former Flying Tiger who had already proven himself one of the war's most gifted and unconventional combat pilots. Boyington was 31 years old, ancient by fighter pilot standards, and he had been given a squadron assembled from replacement pilots and misfits that nobody else particularly wanted. The unit had no distinguished lineage, no combat record, no reputation. What Boyington built from that unpromising material became one of the most storied fighter squadrons in American military history. Boyington understood the Corsair instinctively. He drilled his pilots relentlessly in the tactics that the aircraft demanded, and he did not tolerate half measures, speed, altitude, diving attacks. Never turn with a zero, never slow down, never give the enemy a chance to use his maneuverability advantage. Hit them from above, hit them hard, and keep your speed up. If you miss, do not circle back for a turning fight. Climb back to altitude and set up another pass. Every engagement should last seconds, not minutes. Get in, kill, get out. The Black Sheep flew their first combat mission on September 12, 1943, and over the next 12 weeks, they tore through Japanese air strength in the Solomons with a ferocity that stunned even their own commanders. The squadron's primary targets were the heavily defended Japanese air bases clustered around Rabaul on the island of New Britain. Rabaul was the beating heart of Japanese air power in the South Pacific. From its 5 airfields, the Imperial Japanese Navy projected fighter and bomber strength across the entire Solomons and Bismarck archipelago. Taking Rabaul by ground assault would have cost tens of thousands of American lives. Instead, the decision was made to neutralize it from the air. That meant destroying its air defenses. That meant killing its pilots. And that meant the Corsairs of VMF 214 and their sister squadrons had to fly directly into the most concentrated fighter defense in the Pacific and come out the other side. Rabaul was defended by some of the most experienced fighter pilots remaining in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Veterans of the air campaigns over China, the Dutch East Indies, and the Solomons, who had been flying combat since before most American pilots had earned their wings. Boyington led his Corsairs directly into this hornet's nest with a tactic that was as simple as it was audacious. Fighter sweeps. The Black Sheep would arrive over Rabaul at high altitude, specifically to draw Japanese fighters into the air and destroy them, not to escort bombers, not to attack ground targets, simply to kill zeros. Boyington would sometimes broadcast taunting radio challenges to the Japanese, daring them to come up and fight. When they did, the Corsairs executed the diving, slashing attacks that turned superior altitude and speed into a killing advantage the Zero could not counter. The results were devastating for the Japanese defenders. Boyington himself became a national celebrity, his kill count climbing toward the record held by Eddie Rickenbacker from the First World War. He shot down aircraft with an efficiency that reflected both his skill and the Corsairs' dominance in the high-speed diving engagement. By the time Boyington was shot down over Rabaul on January 3, 1944, he had been credited with 28 confirmed aerial victories, making him the leading Marine ace of the war. He survived the shootdown, was captured by the Japanese, and spent the remaining months of the war as a prisoner. The Black Sheep Squadron as a whole had destroyed over 200 Japanese aircraft between September of 1943 and January of 1944, a rate of attrition that the Japanese Navy could not sustain. For the Japanese forces defending Rabaul, the sustained Corsair offensive created a crisis that went beyond simple attrition. Every pilot lost over Rabaul was a veteran, a man with hundreds of hours of combat experience who could not be replaced. Japan's pilot training pipeline, already strained by the losses at Midway and in the Solomons, could not produce replacements of equivalent quality. Where the Americans rotated their experienced pilots home to serve as instructors, feeding their hard-won knowledge back into the training system and producing better and better new pilots, Japan kept its veterans in combat until they were killed. The result was a death spiral. As Japan's best pilots fell to the Corsairs over Rabaul, the pilots who replaced them were less experienced, less skilled, and more vulnerable. Each cycle of attrition made the next cycle worse. The Corsair was not just destroying aircraft, it was destroying the institutional knowledge of the Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm. The pace of killing accelerated as more Corsair squadrons arrived in the theatre, and their pilots accumulated experience. First, Lieutenant Robert Hansen of VMF 215 became one of the most lethal Corsair pilots of the entire war, during a concentrated burst of combat over Rabaul and New Britain in January of 1944. In a span of just 17 days, Hansen shot down 20 Japanese aircraft, a rate of destruction that reflected both his extraordinary skill and the Corsairs' absolute dominance in the high-speed engagement. Hansen's preferred tactic was the high-speed diving pass that the Corsair made so devastating. He would position himself above the Japanese formation, select a target, and dive at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, closing the distance so quickly that the Zero pilot often never saw him coming. A 2-second burst from 650 caliber machine guns at close range was enough to disintegrate a Zero. Then Hansen would use his dive speed to zoom climb back to altitude and set up the next pass before the Japanese formation could react. Hansen was killed on February 3, 1944, not in air-to-air combat, but by anti-aircraft fire during a strafing run. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. He was 23 years old. Japanese after-action reports from the Rabaul defense increasingly reflected the desperation of men who understood they were losing a war of attrition they could not win. Pilot diaries recovered after the war and accounts gathered during post-war interrogations described a growing dread that attached itself to the sound of the approaching Corsairs. Pilots who had once volunteered for interception missions began finding reasons to stay on the ground. Experienced flight leaders who had survived years of combat wrote letters home that read like men who knew their time was running out. The Corsair had not just outperformed the Zero, it had broken the confidence of the men who flew it. And through it all, from the Solomons to the Bismarcks, from the Marianas to the Philippines, there was the sound, that eerie rising whistle that announced the Corsair's approach. It came from the oil cooler intakes, housed in the roots of those distinctive gull wings, amplified by the airflow dynamics of the aircraft's unique shape. At cruise speed, the sound was noticeable but not alarming. In a shallow dive, it intensified. But in a full combat dive, when the Corsair was plummeting toward its target at speeds that pushed the aircraft to its structural limits, the whistle became something that survivors described as otherworldly, a keening wail that rose in pitch and volume until it seemed to fill the sky itself. Japanese ground troops who endured Corsair strafing runs reported that the sound arrived before the aircraft was visible, a high-pitched scream that grew in intensity until the sky split apart with the hammering of 650 caliber machine guns. By the time you heard the whistle reach its peak, the bullets were already arriving. There was no time to take cover. There was barely time to be afraid. The whistle entered Japanese military consciousness not as a curiosity, but as a harbinger of death, one that triggered immediate, visceral fear. Ground troops learned to associate the sound with devastating strafing runs that shredded positions they thought were concealed. Anti-aircraft gunners learned that the whistle preceded an attack approach so fast that tracking the aircraft was nearly impossible. And Japanese pilots learned that hearing the whistle behind them meant a Corsair had achieved the one position from which their Zero's agility could not save them, a high-speed diving approach from the rear quarter, where speed, not maneuverability, determined who lived and who died. They gave the sound a name: Shi no Kuchibue, the whistle of death. It was not a nickname born of mockery. It was born of experience. It was born of watching friends die. The Battle of Okinawa, which raged from April 1st to June 22nd of 1945, became the Corsair's supreme proving ground, and the place where the whistle of death was heard more often and more feared than anywhere else in the Pacific. By this point in the war, the aircraft had been refined through more than 2 years of continuous combat experience and engineering improvements. The carrier landing problems that had once earned it the name Ensign Eliminator had been largely solved through modifications to the landing gear, oleo, struts, the addition of a small spoiler on the right wing to counteract the torque-induced stall asymmetry, and refined approach procedures developed by Royal Navy pilots who had pioneered Corsair carrier operations in the European theatre. Corsairs were now operating from fleet carriers and escort carriers, as well as land bases, and the aircraft that launched from those carrier decks in 1945 was a significantly more refined machine than the one that had stumbled through its debut over Bougainville 2 years earlier. Marine Corsair squadrons operated from captured airfields on Okinawa itself, most notably Yontan and Kadena, providing close air support to the Army and Marine ground troops locked in some of the most savage fighting of the entire Pacific War. The battle for Okinawa was not a sweeping campaign of maneuver. It was a grinding, yard-by-yard siege, in which Japanese defenders had fortified the island's natural limestone ridges, caves, and ravines into an interlocking defensive network designed to make the Americans pay for every foot of ground in blood. Positions like Sugarloaf Hill, Shuri Castle, and Hacksaw Ridge became synonymous with the kind of brutal, close-quarters combat that tested American forces to their absolute limit. For the Marines and soldiers fighting their way through those fortifications, the Corsair became something close to divine intervention. When Japanese positions proved too heavily fortified for infantry assault, too deeply embedded in limestone for naval gunfire to reach, the call would go out for close air support. Corsairs would roll in with 500-pound bombs, high-velocity aircraft rockets, and napalm canisters, delivering ordnance with a precision that larger bombers could not match. The pilots would come in low, sometimes terrifyingly low, dropping their weapons within yards of friendly positions to collapse cave entrances, silence machine gun nests, and incinerate defensive positions that had cost entire platoons to approach. Marines on the ground gave the Corsair pilots a name that reflected their gratitude and their awe. They called them the Angels of Okinawa. For the infantry, the sight of those bent wings rolling in overhead meant salvation. To the Japanese defenders dug into Okinawa's ridges and caves, those same aircraft earned a very different title. The whistle that preceded each attack run became the sound of the earth itself being torn apart above them. Japanese soldiers who survived Corsair attacks and were later captured described the experience with a consistency that suggested deep psychological trauma. The whistle came first, always, a rising, piercing sound that could be heard even inside cave fortifications. Then the hammering of machine guns and the concussion of bombs and rockets that turned solid limestone into gravel. For troops who had been told that the Japanese fighting spirit would prevail over American machines, the Corsair was an unanswerable argument. One pilot who flew Corsairs over Okinawa with Marine Fighting Squadron 222, VMF 222, of Marine Aircraft Group 14, left a first-person account that captures both the Corsair's lethality and its extraordinary resilience in a way that no statistics can. It was during the height of the Okinawa campaign, and he was flying combat air patrol with his wingman over Buckner Bay off the island's southern coast. The waters below were crowded with American naval vessels, a massive armada of warships, transports, and supply ships supporting the ground campaign. These ships were under constant threat from kamikaze attacks, and the Corsair pilots on patrol were the first line of defense against the suicide planes that appeared with terrifying regularity. During the patrol, one of the escort carriers in the bay, the USS Franklin, took a direct hit from a kamikaze. The explosion sent smoke and flame billowing from the stricken ship, while every anti-aircraft gun in the fleet opened up, filling the sky with tracer fire and flak bursts. Then a second, unidentified aircraft was reported entering the area at low altitude. The pilot scanned the horizon and spotted a Zero flying extremely low over the water, hugging the wave tops in an attempt to slip through the air defenses undetected, almost certainly another kamikaze intent on finding a ship to die against. He pushed the stick forward, dove after the Zero, and got on its tail at just 20 feet above the ocean surface, closing at 300 miles per hour. At that altitude, there was zero margin for error. A moment's misjudgment, a slight dip of the nose, and the Corsair would hit the water at a speed that would shatter it like glass. He opened up with his 6 Browning machine guns. The Zero banked hard left to evade the stream of fire, and for a brief instant the two aircraft were in a turning fight barely above the waves, the kind of engagement every manual said to avoid. But at 20 feet and 300 miles per hour, there was no room for the elegant maneuvers that had once made the Zero supreme. The Zero's wingtip touched the water, and the aircraft cartwheeled violently across the surface, wing over wing, before sinking beneath the waves. At that speed, hitting the water was like hitting a concrete wall. The pilot never had a chance to escape, but as the Corsair pilot pulled back on the stick to regain altitude, he felt 2 distinct thuds. He had been hit, not by Japanese fire, but by friendly anti-aircraft rounds from American naval vessels below. The gunners on those ships, their nerves shredded by the kamikaze attack on the Franklin, had been firing at anything in the sky, and 2 of their rounds had found the Corsair. The damage was severe. Hydraulic pressure dropped to 0, which meant the landing gear and wing flaps could not be lowered for a normal landing. The pilot radioed Yontan Airfield and requested permission for a wheels-up crash landing, but he was informed that attempting such a landing while the aircraft was still carrying live ammunition and fuel would in all likelihood end in an explosion that would kill him and potentially damage the crowded airfield. Air Command eventually determined that his best option would be a controlled water landing offshore. This was the kind of situation that would have been a death sentence in most fighters of the era. But the pilot noted something that every Corsair pilot in the Pacific understood in their bones. The Corsair was like a seasoned prizefighter who could take punches on the chin and refuse to go down. On countless fighter sweeps and low-level bombing runs, their aircraft had absorbed hit after hit from Japanese anti-aircraft fire and still carried their pilots home. The Corsair's structural integrity, its armoured cockpit, its self-sealing fuel tanks, these were not just engineering features written into a specification document. They were the margin between life and death, repeated thousands of times across the Pacific for the pilots who depended on them every time they strapped into that cockpit. The Japanese forces defending Okinawa experienced the Corsairs' dominance as a cumulative catastrophe. The whistle preceded strafing runs that obliterated carefully prepared defensive positions. It preceded bombing runs that collapsed cave networks. It preceded rocket attacks that turned artillery emplacements into craters. And above the battlefield, Corsairs swept the skies of any Japanese aircraft that attempted to provide support or reinforcement. By the time the battle for Okinawa ended, American pilots flying Corsairs had scored approximately 2,140 air-to-air victories against just 189 Corsairs lost in combat. That is an 11-to-1 kill ratio, not against inexperienced pilots in inferior aircraft, but against an air force that had once dominated the entire Pacific. The statistics tell a story of absolute supremacy, but numbers alone cannot capture what the Corsairs' dominance meant strategically. Japan's inability to challenge the Corsair in the air led to one of the most desperate decisions in military history. By late 1944, Japanese commanders had arrived at a conclusion that was as terrible as it was inescapable. They could not beat the Corsair, or the Hellcat, or the growing armada of American fighters that filled the Pacific skies with overwhelming numbers and overwhelming quality. Conventional air-to-air combat against the Americans had become a method of suicide that achieved nothing, so they chose a different kind of suicide, one that at least had the chance of inflicting damage: the kamikaze. Japanese pilots, many of them barely trained replacements with only enough flight hours to take off and navigate to a target area, were ordered to load their aircraft with explosives and fly them directly into Allied ships. The Zero, the aircraft that had once ruled the Pacific with absolute authority, that had achieved a 12-to-1 kill ratio in the opening months of the war, was repurposed as a guided bomb. It was the ultimate admission of defeat in the air war, an acknowledgement, written in the blood of Japan's own young men, that the contest for air superiority was over. The Corsair and its fellow American fighters had won so completely that Japan's only remaining aerial tactic was to bypass combat entirely and convert pilots and aircraft into single-use weapons. Even the kamikaze strategy was blunted by the Corsairs. Combat air patrols flown by Corsair and Hellcat pilots over the fleet at Okinawa intercepted hundreds of kamikaze aircraft before they could reach their targets. The combination of speed, firepower, and radar-directed vectoring meant that Corsair pilots could identify, intercept, and destroy incoming kamikazes at distances that gave the fleet precious seconds to prepare. For every kamikaze that got through to strike a ship, multiple others were blown out of the sky by fighters whose capabilities the Japanese could no longer hope to match. Saburo Sakai, Japan's highest-scoring surviving ace of the war, was one of the few Japanese pilots who fought from the first day of the conflict to the last and lived to write about it. Sakai had flown Zeros over Pearl Harbor, over the Philippines, over the Dutch East Indies, over Guadalcanal. He had been shot through the head by a rear gunner over Guadalcanal in August of 1942 and survived, losing the use of one eye but returning to combat. He fought against every type of Allied fighter that appeared in the Pacific, and he survived them all. In his autobiography, Sakai offered an assessment of the Corsair that carried the weight of a man who had personally experienced both sides of the Pacific Air War's transformation. He acknowledged that the Corsair was the superior interceptor and dogfighter, and that it was the most feared of all Allied aircraft among Japanese forces. This was not the assessment of a defeated man grasping for excuses. This was the professional judgment of a combat pilot with 64 confirmed victories who understood, better than anyone who survived the war, the capabilities of every aircraft he had faced across 4 years of continuous combat. What made Sakai's assessment particularly significant was what it revealed about the psychological dimension of the Corsair's impact. Japanese forces did not merely lose to the Corsair, they were terrorized by it. From Guadalcanal to the home islands, from the first uncertain encounters in the Solomons to the final desperate kamikaze defense of Okinawa, the Corsair's progression from dismissed novelty to most feared weapon tracked precisely with Japan's decline from Pacific hegemon to besieged island nation. The aircraft had become inseparable from the strategic reality it helped create. Beyond the air-to-air war, the Corsair's impact as a bomber reshaped the Pacific campaign in ways that are often overlooked. By the end of World War II, Corsairs had flown 64,000 bombing sorties, delivering 15,621 short tons of ordnance. That represented 70% of all bombs dropped by fighter aircraft during the entire Pacific War. 70%. One aircraft type, delivering the overwhelming majority of fighter-delivered ordnance across a theatre of war that spanned millions of square miles of ocean. The Corsair was not just winning dogfights. It was systematically dismantling Japan's ability to fight on the ground, at sea, and in the air simultaneously. The contrast between the two nations' approaches to fighter development tells a story that extends far beyond any single aircraft. America's war machine continuously improved, adapted, and innovated. The Corsair itself went through multiple variants, each addressing shortcomings identified in combat and incorporating improvements suggested by the pilots who flew it. The carrier landing problems were solved. The engine was refined. The weapons systems were upgraded. Each iteration was better than the last, because America had built a system that turned combat experience into engineering improvements at industrial speed. Japan, by contrast, never replaced the Zero. Despite knowing by mid-1943 that the Zero was being outmatched by new American fighters, Japanese industry could not produce a successor in sufficient numbers to matter. Designs like the Kawanishi N1K Shiden and the Mitsubishi J2M Raiden showed promise but arrived too late, and in too few numbers to change the trajectory of the war. The Zero that Japanese pilots flew in 1945 was fundamentally the same aircraft that had attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. In 4 years of the most intense aerial combat in history, Japan's premier fighter had barely evolved. Its enemies had transformed. The pipeline of pilots told the same story. America built a training infrastructure that took combat lessons from the Pacific and Atlantic and fed them directly into the curriculum for the next generation of aviators. Experienced pilots were rotated home after a set number of missions, not as a reward but as a strategic investment. Their knowledge, the hard-won understanding of what worked and what got you killed, was transmitted to thousands of new pilots before they ever saw combat. Japan had no equivalent system. Its experienced pilots stayed in the fight until they were killed or captured, and the knowledge they carried died with them. By 1944, the average Japanese replacement pilot had a fraction of the flight hours of his American counterpart. By 1945, some kamikaze pilots had barely enough training to take off, navigate to a target, and dive. They did not need to know how to land. The Corsair that descended on Japanese positions in those final months of the war was not the same aircraft that had stumbled through its first engagement on Valentine's Day of 1943. It had been refined, improved, and perfected through 27 months of continuous combat. The pilots who flew it were products of the most sophisticated training system in the world, men who arrived in the Pacific already knowing the lessons that their predecessors had paid for in blood. And the aircraft itself had become something that transcended its specifications and statistics. It had become a sound, that whistle, the whistle that came before the guns, before the bombs, before the rockets, the whistle that told you the Americans were coming and there was nothing you could do about it. In the early months of 1943, Japanese pilots had dismissed the big, bent-winged American fighter as another clumsy opponent for the Zero to devour. By the end of the war, the mere sound of its approach sent ground troops scrambling for cover and made Japanese pilots question whether taking off was worth the near certainty of not coming back. From mockery to mortal terror in 2 years, the Corsair had not just defeated the Zero, it had broken the Imperial Japanese Navy's belief in its own air power, and it had done so with a sound that its enemies named for what it delivered. The F4U Corsair entered the Pacific as an unproven, temperamental machine that killed its own trainees and could not land on a carrier. It emerged as the most feared fighter aircraft in the theatre, with a kill ratio that no other Allied fighter matched and a bombing record that dwarfed all others combined. In between, American engineering, American industrial capacity, and American pilots rewrote the rules of Pacific air warfare and demonstrated something that Japan's military leadership never fully grasped until it was too late. American power was not static. It learned. It adapted. It improved. And it did so faster than any adversary could keep pace with. Saburo Sakai, the ace who had fought the Corsair from Guadalcanal to the home islands, survived the war to reflect on what he had witnessed. His conclusion was not one of bitterness, but of professional respect. The Corsair, he said, was simply the better aircraft, flown by pilots who got better as the war went on, while his own side grew weaker. The whistle, he might have added, was just the announcement. The reckoning was what followed. These stories cost something to live through. The least we can do is remember them. If this one meant something to you, subscribe so you don't miss the next. A like helps more people find these videos, and the comments here have become something special, veterans' descendants sharing what their families never talked about. Be part of that. I'll see you next time.